This isn't Apple announcing better battery life, it's Apple reacting to a long-standing narrative problem it's ignored for years. Hear me out because the implications here go well beyond milliamp hours. According to the latest rumors, the iPhone 18 Pro Max could finally leap past 5,100 milliamps, dwarfing Apple's previous ceilings and promising next level battery life this year. That's the headline you've seen on Mac Rumors and Phone Arena, but the headline isn't the story. What's telling isn't just more capacity, it's what Apple chooses to emphasize now in 2026. Let's unpack that. For half a decade, Apple's strategic position was battery. We do what's necessary, but we don't chase numbers. Apple's long game has always been hardware software synergy, tight optimization, efficient chips, and real world experience that feels smooth. That's why the 17 Pro Max, with a battery smaller on paper than many Android rivals, still topped CNET's 35 phone endurance test. Outlasting competitors with much larger cells, it outlasted phones that brag about size, not strategy. But now something subtle shifts. The rumored A20 Pro chip built on TSMC's 2 nanometer process promises efficiency boosts, and Apple almost certainly hoped that alone would let it keep its endurance crown without bumping capacity much. But the chatter isn't just about efficiency anymore, it's about putting actual more battery inside the phone. That's a psychological pivot. It's Apple saying, yes, size matters now, even for us. Think of it like this. It's the corporate equivalent of a politician who once said they don't care about polls, suddenly releasing a focus group-driven ad campaign about being practical. It doesn't feel organic. It feels like damage control. Why? Because Samsung and Google haven't exactly sat still. Samsung has chased capacity, bigger numbers, faster chargers, and made it part of its story for years. Samsung's users are trained to care about numbers because that's the language Samsung sells in ads and spec sheets. Apple's language has been experience, efficiency, ecosystem, but today's consumer isn't a reviewer comparing numbers in a spreadsheet. The silent majority just wants a phone that doesn't beg for a charger at 5 p.m. They don't know Apple's software metrics. They know anxiety when the battery dips below 20%. This is Apple understanding that narrative psychology matters as much as chip architecture. And here's where the subtle competitive framing gets fun. Would Apple make a big deal out of battery if Samsung didn't continue pushing battery capacity as a headline bragging right? Probably not. Apple rarely plays in that sandbox unless it sees a narrative where it could be tagged as lagging. Meanwhile, Google leans even harder into AI and software smarts, which is far more abstract to normal users than a number they can point at, 5,200 milliamps. In psychological terms, Apple is meeting Samsung on Samsung's own turf so that mid-market consumers don't start thinking Android just lasts longer. That fear of losing perceived endurance leadership feels real inside Cupertino right now. Now let's layer this with real user behavior. Tech Twitter is already divided. Some say it's only a little bigger battery with disdain. Others are ready to crown a new king of endurance. But here's the silent majority twist. Most everyday users don't care about such tiny percentage jumps. They don't measure milliamps, they just want less anxiety. And the irony is brutal. Apple's iPhone 17 Pro Max already routinely lasted a full day for millions of users, often with battery left over, something that reviewers note but normal folks just take for granted. So why highlight battery now? Because perception compounds. Apple doesn't need to actually beat Samsung in lab tests. It needs enough server-side narrative ammo so that when a friend asks, is the iPhone better than a Galaxy? There's a simple answer, yes, even the battery lasts longer. That's the battleground where everyday decisions happen, not in the nuanced paragraphs of Forbes or Phone Arena. And there's a deeper psychological layer. Apple is subtly reframing its identity from Silent optimizer to strategic reactor, not because it wants to, but because it has to. The foldable iPhone rumors suggesting batteries even larger than 5,500 milliamps feel like Apple acknowledging that comfort and fear of running out of power is becoming central to consumer choice, not impressive silicon alone. This isn't about battery specs, this is about Apple trying to own every emotional corner of the decision process. Ask yourself, would Apple push this narrative if people weren't already whispering that Android phones just last longer? Would Google pivot its entire AI strategy if users were obsessed with raw processing? Would Samsung brag about numbers if the average user cared only about brand loyalty? What's revealing isn't the rumor. What's revealing is that Apple chose to surface it now, before Samsung's next big event, before Google's AI playbook gets another chapter. Apple is pre-positioning its critics and its rivals. And that's the part the loud tech crowd is missing. They're obsessing over percent increases and benchmarks, while the silent majority just wants a phone that doesn't trigger battery panic. Apple knows that emotional truth, and it's weaponizing that knowledge to quiet rival narratives before they can take hold. At the end of the day, this move tells me more about fear than ambition, because when a company that once claimed it didn't care about numbers starts leaning into them, that's not confidence. That's a psychological reaction to competition. And in the chess match between Apple, Samsung, and Google, this isn't a product update, it's a strategic repositioning. See you next one. Peace out.